The first child disappeared on a Tuesday, though nobody noticed until Thursday morning when Mrs. Abernathy found little Timothy's bed empty, sheets cold as winter stone. The window hung open like a gaping wound, and the only clue was a peculiar smell lingering in the room. Coal smoke and something else, something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. Outside, the morning mist clung to Millbrook like a shroud, and in the distance, the 6:15 locomotive's whistle echoed across the valley with its usual mournful wail. Dr. Edmund Hartwell had been the town physician for nearly 2 decades, but he'd never seen anything quite like what began happening that autumn of 1847. Children, previously normal and healthy, would wake before dawn and drift, through the streets as if pulled by invisible strings. Their parents would find them at the railroad crossing on Elm Street, standing perfectly still, faces turned toward the approaching locomotive with expressions of such profound longing that it chilled witnesses to the bone. "It's unnatural," whispered Martha Crane to her husband as they watched their 7-year-old daughter Lucy take her place among the other children. "Look at their eyes, Thomas. They're not seeing us any more." Thomas Crane, a practical man who'd built his fortune in lumber, found himself helpless before this inexplicable phenomenon. The children would stand there, motionless as scarecrows, until the great iron beast thundered past in a symphony of steam and steel. Only then would they move, turning as one to follow the tracks into the dark woods beyond, their small forms disappearing into the wilderness like smoke. Most returned by dawn, muddy and exhausted, with no memory of where they'd been. But not all. Timothy Abernathy was the first to vanish completely, followed by the Morrison twins, then Sarah Blackwood, the preacher's daughter. Each disappearance left the town more on edge, more desperate for answers that seemed to dissolve like morning dew whenever anyone tried to grasp them. Dr. Hartwell documented everything with the methodical precision of a man of science. The children's pupils dilated strangely in the presence of train sounds. Their body temperature dropped several degrees during these episodes. Most disturbing of all, they spoke in their sleep of the conductor and the last station and places with names that existed on no earthly map. The railroad company sent investigators, stern men in black suits who asked pointed questions and took copious notes. They examined the tracks, the crossing signals, even the locomotive itself, but found nothing amiss. The engine was a standard 440 American type, manufactured in Philadelphia and perfectly maintained. The engineer, a weathered man named Murphy who'd driven trains for 30 years, swore he'd never seen anything like it. "They just appear," Murphy told the investigators, his hands shaking as he lit his pipe. "One moment the crossing's empty, next thing I know there's a dozen children standing there like they're waiting for something. And their faces." He shuddered. "Christ Almighty, their faces. Like they're seeing heaven and hell all at once." The townspeople began keeping vigil, forming committees to watch their children through the night. But the pull seemed strongest when adults weren't looking, as if whatever called to the young ones could sense observation and waited for moments of vulnerability. Parents would doze for mere minutes, only to wake and find their children gone. Mrs. Abernathy, driven half-mad by grief, took to walking the railroad tracks herself, calling Timothy's name until her voice went hoarse. On the third night of her solitary searches, she found something that would haunt her remaining days. A child's shoe, small and scuffed, sitting perfectly placed on the rail as if someone had carefully positioned it there. Inside was a note written in Timothy's careful script, "The conductor says we're almost home." Dr. Hartwell received the note with growing unease. The handwriting was indeed Timothy's, but the boy had been missing for over a week. Where had he written it? How had it found its way into his abandoned shoe? And what did "almost home" mean when Timothy's home was a modest cottage on Maple Street, nowhere near the railroad tracks? The physician decided to conduct his own investigation. Armed with a lantern and his medical bag, he positioned himself near the crossing just after midnight, determined to observe the phenomenon firsthand. The night was uncommonly still, so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Fog rolled in from the river, thick and choking, carrying that same sickly sweet smell he'd noticed around the affected children. At precisely 2:17 a.m., they began to emerge from the mist. First came Lucy Crane, her nightgown ghostly white in the lamplight, bare feet making no sound on the cobblestones. Then the Fletcher boy, the youngest Patterson girl, others whose names Dr. Hartwell had known since birth. They moved with the fluid grace of sleepwalkers, but their eyes were wide open, fixed on some distant point beyond the rails. Dr. Hartwell tried to intercept Lucy, placing himself directly in her path, but she walked through him, not around, but through, as if he were made of nothing more substantial than morning mist. His lantern flickered and nearly died, and for a terrifying moment he felt a crushing cold envelope his body, as though he'd been plunged into Arctic waters. The children arranged themselves along the crossing with mechanical precision, spacing themselves exactly 3 feet apart, faces turned eastward toward the approaching headlight of the night freight. But this train wasn't scheduled to arrive until dawn. Dr. Hartwell consulted his pocket watch, confusion mounting. The distant whistle grew louder, more insistent, playing a melody that seemed to reach inside his chest and squeeze his heart. When the locomotive finally emerged from the fog, Dr. Hartwell understood why the investigators had found nothing wrong. This wasn't the regular freight train. This engine was older, much older, its brass fittings tarnished green, its smokestack belching not steam but something thicker, more viscous. The passenger cars behind it were dark except for a single window near the front, from which a warm golden light spilled out onto the tracks. As the phantom train approached, the children began to sing, not with their voices, but with something deeper, a harmonious vibration that seemed to emanate from their very souls. Dr. Hartwell found himself swaying to the rhythm, his vision blurring, his scientific mind struggling against an overwhelming urge to step forward and join them. Through the illuminated window, he glimpsed a figure in a conductor's uniform, tall and impossibly thin, with eyes that reflected the lamplight like pools of mercury. The conductor raised one skeletal hand in what might have been a greeting or a summons, and the children responded by taking a single step toward the tracks. Dr. Hartwell tried to cry out, to warn them, but his voice had abandoned him entirely. He could only watch in helpless horror as the train began to slow, steam hissing from its brakes with a sound like dying breath. The rear car's door slid open, revealing not the expected cargo hold but what appeared to be row upon row of empty seats, each one perfectly sized for a small passenger. One by one, the children climbed aboard. Lucy Crane paused at the threshold, turning to look directly at Dr. Hartwell with eyes that held terrible wisdom. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear over the mechanical symphony of the phantom locomotive. "Tell them we're going home." The door closed with a soft thud that somehow carried more finality than the tolling of funeral bells. The train lurched forward, gathering speed with unnatural smoothness, and within moments had vanished back into the fog, leaving only the acrid smell of coal smoke and that underlying sweetness that Dr. Hartwell now recognized as the scent of jasmine, the same flower they'd used at little Timothy's memorial service. Dawn broke gray and cold, revealing the crossing empty except for Dr. Hartwell, who knelt on the ground clutching his medical bag like a talisman. His carefully maintained notes lay scattered around him, pages filled with observations that no rational mind could accept. When the townspeople found him there an hour later, his hair had turned completely white. The disappearances stopped after that night, but the town of Millbrook never fully recovered. Those parents who'd lost children to the phantom train aged rapidly, their grief carving deep lines into their faces. Those whose children had returned found their sons and daughters forever changed, distant and dreamy, prone to staring at nothing for hours on end, speaking occasionally of friends who were waiting at the next station. Dr. Hartwell attempted to document his experience in his medical journals, but the words seemed to rearrange themselves on the page, transforming his carefully reasoned observations into children's nursery rhymes and locomotive timetables for destinations that existed only in nightmare. He began to suspect that whatever force controlled the phantom train also controlled what could be said about it, limiting testimony to fragments and impressions that would sound like madness to outside ears. The railroad company quietly discontinued the night freight service, claiming mechanical difficulties, but the tracks remained. Local children were forbidden from playing near them, though parents noticed their young ones would sometimes pause during games to cock their heads, as if listening to distant music only they could hear. Mrs. Crane never spoke of Lucy again, but neighbors reported seeing her standing at her bedroom window each night, holding a small dress and gazing toward the railroad crossing. She would remain there until dawn, motionless as a statue, waiting for something that would never come. The Patterson family moved away within a month, followed by the Fletchers and several others. Those who remained found themselves listening for train whistles even when they knew no trains were scheduled, jumping at every distant sound that might herald the return of that impossible locomotive. Dr. Hartwell continued his practice, but his patients noticed changes. He would sometimes stop mid-examination, his stethoscope pressed to a child's chest, and whisper, "Do you hear that? The conductor's calling." Parents began taking their children to the physician in the next town over, unwilling to expose their young ones to whatever haunted Millbrook's doctor. On cold nights when the fog rolled in thick from the river, residents would bar their doors and windows, gathering their children close and singing hymns to drown out other sounds that might drift through the darkness. But even the most fervent prayers couldn't entirely mask the distant echo of steel wheels on phantom tracks, or the mournful whistle that seemed to call out the names of the missing children. Years passed, and Millbrook adapted to its new reality with the grim resilience of a community that has learned to live with inexplicable loss. The railroad crossing became overgrown with weeds, but the tracks themselves remained pristine, as if invisible maintenance crews kept them ready for their spectral cargo. New families moved to town, drawn by affordable properties whose previous owners had fled, but they were warned by longtime residents to keep their children indoors after dark. Dr. Hartwell aged rapidly, his once precise handwriting becoming increasingly erratic. His final journal entry, discovered after his death in 1853, consisted of a single line repeated hundreds of times: "The conductor remembers every passenger." The entry was dated the day before he was found dead in his study, slumped over his desk with his medical instruments arranged around him like the components of some bizarre ritual. The room smelled strongly of coal smoke and jasmine, though neither had any earthly source. His pocket watch had stopped at 2:17 a.m. At his funeral, Mrs. Abernathy approached the graveside with a small package wrapped in Timothy's favorite blanket. Inside were dozens of letters, all written in her son's careful script, all postmarked from impossible places: Shadowmere Station, Whistle Stop Crossing, the final terminal.